was the Queen for a very long time. And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity.
The room had been prepared for a routine family discussion, but Princess Anne arrived carrying something far more dangerous than a briefing paper. She carried a decision. With Charles seated only feet away, and Camilla watching her every movement, Anne placed both hands on the table, refused to soften her expression, and delivered the sentence that shattered the evening. Camilla will never lead this royal family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had called the restricted meeting at Windsor Castle with only Camilla, Anne, William, and Catherine present. The gathering was meant to decide who would guide the family during periods when the king reduced his public workload. That guidance covered internal disputes, ceremonial preparations, and moments of national pressure. It did not replace the sovereign. It determined whose judgment would carry weight when the family needed direction quickly. Anne made the central boundary unmistakable. She stated directly that Camilla would never be permitted to lead the royal family or exercise authority over the separate households of senior working royals. A separate royal household meant the private staff, duties, advisors, and decisions attached to each senior family member. The Princess Royal argued that marriage to the monarch did not create control over William and Catherine's future responsibilities. Camilla's face stiffened. She removed her hand from the table and asked whether Anne was challenging her marriage, her title, or Charles himself. The Queen's question carried hurt as well as anger. Anne answered that she was defending the crown's future, not attacking the king's wife. Her tone remained controlled, but there was no space left for compromise. Charles looked from his sister to Camilla, visibly distressed. He started to intervene, then stopped when Anne reminded him that private affection and constitutional leadership were not the same responsibility. Constitutional leadership meant authority connected to the crown's official structure, not influence gained through personal closeness. The distinction struck at the heart of his marriage. William said nothing. Instead, the prince lowered his gaze and pushed his chair slightly backwards. That silence became its own statement. Catherine noticed it immediately, and Camilla did too. Anne had spoken aloud what the future king appeared unwilling to deny. Anne then placed a handwritten list of leadership boundaries before Charles. The document proved her declaration was not an impulsive attack. She had studied the problem, defined the limits, and arrived prepared to force a decision. Camilla asked how long Anne had been working against her. The Princess Royal did not answer immediately. Anne's words had detonated inside Windsor, but the true damage could not be understood until each person at that table confronted what they stood to lose. Anne's declaration did not strike everyone in the same way. To Camilla, it sounded like rejection. To Charles, it sounded like a warning he could no longer postpone. To William, it sounded like permission to acknowledge his deepest concern. And to Catherine, sitting almost motionless beside him, it revealed that the family was no longer arguing over ceremonies or titles. They were fighting over who could be trusted with the monarchy's emotional center. Anne had spent decades watching duty survive scandals, disappointments, and private grief. She believed royal leadership had to come from service, restraint, and earned trust, rather than marriage or closeness to the sovereign. The monarchy's emotional center meant the person or group the family relied upon during moments of internal pressure. To the Princess Royal, that trust could never be assumed. It had to be proven repeatedly. Camilla heard something far more personal. She had endured years of public scrutiny and believed her loyalty to Charles had earned a permanent place inside the family's closest circle. Anne's declaration threatened more than influence. It reopened the fear that acceptance beside the king might never become full belonging within the crown. Charles rubbed his forehead and asked whether his sister understood what public discovery of the dispute could do to his wife. The king feared that restricting Camilla would be interpreted as a rejection of his judgment as both husband and sovereign. Anne did understand. She simply believed avoiding the truth would cause greater humiliation later. William then spoke with careful control. His household, his children, and his preparation for the future crown could not be directed from another royal residence. A royal household meant the private staff, advisors, schedules, and responsibilities attached to a senior family member. The prince's voice remained calm, but Catherine noticed his hand tightening around the edge of his folder. Catherine watched Camilla struggle to remain composed. She agreed that the boundaries were necessary, yet sadness replaced any sense of victory. The princess understood how quickly ceremony disappeared when family pain entered the room. Camilla was still queen, but in that moment, she looked like a woman hearing that loyalty had limits. Camilla noticed Anne and William exchange a brief glance. She asked whether they had discussed the issue before the meeting. Neither answered directly. Their silence confirmed enough. Charles finally admitted that warnings about blurred authority had reached him before. The confession changed everything. This was not sudden rebellion. It was the final stage of a conflict he had delayed. Camilla asked who first questioned her authority. Anne refused to name anyone yet. The dispute was no longer simply Anne against Camilla, because one forgotten rehearsal had already turned private unease into an irreversible royal fracture. Every royal rupture has a moment that appears insignificant until history looks backwards. In this story, it was not a coronation, a public speech, or a national crisis. It was a closed ceremonial rehearsal at St. George's Hall, where one instruction, delivered in a calm voice, crossed an invisible boundary. Anne witnessed it. William remembered it. Catherine absorbed it in silence. And Camilla never imagined that the moment would later be used against her. Camilla had gradually become more involved in family schedules, ceremonial seating, and communication between royal households, while Charles focused on state responsibilities. A royal household meant the private staff, advisors, duties, and decisions attached to each senior family member. Her involvement was often described as support for the king, so the family tolerated it. Yet no one had clearly defined where that support ended, and William and Catherine's independence began. The breaking point came during a private rehearsal for a major national service. Camilla instructed Catherine to surrender the central position already assigned to her and told an aide that all future family placements would be approved through the Queen's office. The command sounded calm. Its meaning was not. She had claimed authority over a separate household without consulting its principals. Catherine did not argue. She stepped away from the marked position, folded her program, and asked whether the instruction had come directly from Charles. Camilla answered, "It comes through me." That sentence became the moment Anne later described in a documented private account as the point of no return. Catherine's restraint protected the rehearsal, but it also revealed how far the interference had gone. William entered minutes later and found his wife standing apart from the main group. He demanded an explanation. Camilla insisted she was preventing disorder, but the prince answered that his household would not be managed through informal command. His anger remained controlled, though Catherine heard the warning beneath every word. Anne watched from beside the rehearsal table. She did not create a public scene. Instead, the Princess Royal closed her notebook, walked towards Catherine, and restored her to the original position without seeking permission. The gesture was quiet, but absolute. Anne later warned Charles in a private recorded conversation that another confrontation would occur unless boundaries were established. The king asked for time, hoping the tension would fade. His delay deepened the resentment and convinced his sister that she would eventually have to act. Back at Windsor, Anne finally named the rehearsal. Camilla turned towards Catherine, knowing denial was no longer possible. The memory of St. George's Hall returned with brutal clarity, and Camilla turned toward Catherine, knowing the next words would decide whether the family could still speak without breaking apart. Camilla did not raise her voice at first. That made the moment more dangerous. She asked Catherine whether she had complained to Anne, then turned toward William and accused him of building a case against her in secret. Before either could answer, Anne stepped between the accusations and the future king. She moved one chair aside, faced Camilla without the protection of titles, and said the dispute belonged to the two of them now. Charles immediately instructed the aides outside the room to leave the corridor. No secretary, courtier, or household official would hear what followed. The family was left alone with years of resentment that had been hidden behind ceremony. That privacy mattered, because the question was no longer who had spoken out of turn. It was whether marriage to the sovereign created authority over the heir's family. Camilla rejected Anne's claim with controlled fury. She said no sister could decide who led the royal family, and reminded everyone that Charles remained sovereign. The sovereign is the reigning monarch who holds the crown's highest formal authority. Her place beside him, she argued, could not be reduced because Anne disapproved of how she used it. Anne pushed her chair backwards and stood directly across from Camilla. She said being beside the king did not create command over William, Catherine, or their children. Support could be respected, loyalty could be honored, but authority had to be earned, clearly defined, and accepted by those expected to follow it. The Princess Royal refused to let closeness to Charles become control over the future crown. Camilla's anger finally cracked. She asked whether she would always remain an outsider, no matter how many years she served. Her voice trembled, exposing the wound beneath the argument. She had fought for acceptance for so long that every boundary now felt like another rejection. Anne acknowledged her devotion to Charles, but would not soften the principle. The monarchy could not design its structure to heal personal pain. Her answer sounded cold, yet she believed sentiment had already allowed confusion to spread too far. Charles rose abruptly and told Anne she had gone too far. A glass shook against the table. Camilla looked towards him, waiting for complete defense. Instead, the king drew a partial boundary. She would remain central to his life and reign, but she would not direct the household of the Prince and Princess of Wales. William then asked whether Charles would put that boundary in writing. Camilla understood instantly that the argument had moved beyond emotion. Charles had spoken as a husband, but William's request demanded that he now act as king, and put the family's most painful boundary into permanent words. Royal power does not always announce itself with crowns, proclamations, or palace balconies. Sometimes it appears in the wording of a private instruction, the order of names on a briefing sheet, or the person allowed to enter a room before a decision is made. As Charles examined Anne's proposed framework, Camilla understood that the battle had moved beyond emotion. The question was no longer whether she felt rejected. It was whether the system would recognize her authority at all. Charles remained sovereign, William remained the direct heir with an independent household, and Camilla's role centered on supporting the king rather than commanding the wider family. A royal household meant the private staff, advisors, schedules, and responsibilities attached to each senior member. The framework did not remove the queen from public life. It defined where her influence ended. Anne held no higher constitutional rank than Camilla. Her power came from decades of service, trust with William, and an unusually direct relationship with Charles. That made the Princess Royal the one person willing to force a decision everyone else had delayed. Charles read the handwritten boundaries in silence. He reached the line stating that separate households could not be overruled by the Queen's office, then placed the paper down. The king admitted that avoiding a direct conversation after the rehearsal had allowed Camilla and William to believe conflicting versions of their authority. His silence had not preserved peace. It had created two rival expectations inside one family. Camilla asked for one concession. She wanted a formal voice in ceremonies held during Charles's reign, not control over William's household. The Queen said she could accept limits, but not public treatment that made her appear irrelevant beside her husband. Catherine finally spoke with unmistakable firmness. She proposed that Camilla be consulted on ceremonies connected directly to Charles, while every decision involving William, their children, and the future household remained independent. The princess understood why the distinction mattered. Respect for the present could not become control over the future. Anne accepted the wording immediately. Her agreement revealed the truth. She had never intended to erase Camilla. She wanted to prevent influence from becoming unaccountable leadership. Charles lifted a fountain pen, wrote "Approved in Principle" across the top, and initialed the page. Camilla watched the pen leave the paper and knew the new reality had begun. Before the meeting ended, a senior aide issued updated instructions, canceling 2 ceremonial approvals previously routed through her office. The ink was barely dry when the first consequences reached the palace corridors, and Camilla was about to discover how quickly a private boundary could change her public world. The first sign of lost influence was not a public announcement. It was an envelope returned unopened. The second was a meeting removed from a diary. By evening, 2 aides who once waited for Camilla's approval were instructed to send their papers directly to William's office. Nothing about the process appeared dramatic from the outside. Inside her private sitting room, however, Camilla realized that Anne's sentence had already become a working reality. Camilla's household received a formal notice stating that requests involving William and Catherine's engagements would now bypass her office. A royal household meant the private staff, advisors, schedules, and responsibilities attached to a senior family member. The notice described the change as a clarification, but everyone understood it as a boundary. Matters connected to Charles remained with the Queen. Decisions involving the Wales family no longer did. Courtiers adjusted with alarming speed. Papers were separated, diaries rewritten, and approvals redirected. That efficiency revealed how much confusion the old arrangement had caused. Staff had been waiting for someone to define who held the final word, and once Charles approved the framework, the palace moved without hesitation. Camilla received a red folder she had already reviewed. A fresh note attached to it stated that final approval now rested elsewhere. She removed the note, read it twice, and placed the folder inside a locked drawer. The Queen did not shout. The quietness made the humiliation heavier. Camilla told her private secretary that the decision made her look tolerated rather than trusted. The aide replied that the difference would remain invisible unless the family allowed the dispute to leak. That reassurance offered little comfort. Camilla knew privacy could hide humiliation, but it could not remove it. Charles visited later and reached for her hand. She pulled away and asked whether he had accepted Anne's position because he believed his sister was right, or because he feared losing William. The king answered honestly. He had feared losing both his son's trust and his wife's peace, and by refusing to choose earlier, he had endangered them both. The truth wounded Camilla more deeply than defense would have. William refused to treat the decision as victory. He ordered his team not to brief the press or describe the change as Camilla's defeat. He told Catherine that protection without restraint could easily become revenge. Anne then returned a ceremonial planning binder with a brief message. For the king's events, your voice remains essential. The gesture preserved dignity while protecting the boundary. That night, Camilla requested a private meeting with Anne alone. After days of arguments conducted through roles and responsibilities, Camilla wanted one final conversation in which neither woman could hide behind the monarchy. There were no advisors waiting outside, no folders arranged between them, and no king present to absorb the tension. Camilla entered the small Windsor sitting room first. Anne followed and closed the door herself. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Camilla removed a brooch Charles had given her, placed it carefully on the table, and asked the question beneath every argument. Did you ever believe I belonged here? Camilla had spent years treating influence as proof of acceptance. For her, being consulted by Charles and included in family decisions meant that the criticism, suspicion, and sacrifice had finally led somewhere. Acceptance inside the monarchy was not simply public approval. It meant being trusted within the family's closest circle. Losing authority, therefore, felt like losing belonging itself. Anne answered with painful honesty. She said she had come to respect Camilla's loyalty to Charles and understood how much she had endured beside him. Yet the Princess Royal had never believed that devotion to the king automatically created the right to direct William, Catherine, or their children. Respect could be earned through service. Command required a separate authority. Camilla finally admitted the truth behind St. George's Hall. She had moved Catherine from the central position because fear had taken control. The Queen believed the younger woman's growing stature would make her invisible inside the institution she had fought so hard to enter. What she called order had really been insecurity, wearing the language of protocol. Anne's posture changed. She had remained rigid throughout the conversation, but now she moved beside Camilla rather than facing her from across the room. The princess told her that Catherine's future place did not erase the role she held beside Charles. One woman represented the present reign, the other was preparing for the next. Their dignity did not have to depend on each other's defeat. Camilla asked whether Anne would repeat her declaration publicly. The princess answered that she would defend the boundary anywhere, but she would never choose to humiliate her personally. The distinction mattered. Duty demanded firmness, not cruelty. Camilla then accepted the limit. She promised not to issue instructions to William or Catherine's household again. She asked only that every mistake not be treated as proof she had never belonged. Anne picked up the brooch and returned it to her. "Your place beside my brother is not in question. Leadership of the future belongs elsewhere." They left separately, yet both agreed to attend the next engagement without visible hostility. Their private peace remained fragile, but the outside world was already preparing to turn one painful family boundary into a national spectacle. By sunrise, the private sentence had escaped Windsor. Phones rang across royal offices, broadcasters abandoned their planned schedules, and newspaper editors rebuilt their front pages around 6 explosive words. Yet the moment that captured public feeling was not a television argument. It was a single newspaper held above a crowd outside Buckingham Palace, its black headline declaring, "Anne draws the line. Camilla will never lead." The leaked account included Anne's declaration and the new limits separating Camilla's role from William and Catherine's household. A royal household meant the staff, advisors, schedules, and responsibilities attached to each senior family member. Some commentators called the change constitutional clarity. Others called it a devastating rejection of the Queen. The difference mattered because one interpretation protected the monarchy's structure, while the other suggested a family had pushed one woman aside. Outside Buckingham Palace, a visitor lifted the Morning Chronicle above the crowd as cameras moved towards the headline. People argued openly beneath it. Some praised Anne for defending the future crown. Others said she had wounded Camilla after years of public service. The palace had not issued enough detail to settle the debate, so the public filled the silence with loyalty, anger, and sympathy. A national broadcaster opened its evening program with a sharp conclusion. "This is not a struggle for the throne. It is a struggle over who speaks for the family standing nearest to it." That framing transformed a private boundary into a national question about authority. Camilla faced the cameras beside Charles at a scheduled reception. A reporter shouted a question about Anne. The Queen paused for half a second, but the King touched her elbow and guided her forward. Charles offered no words, yet the gesture made clear that Camilla's place beside him remained protected. Anne refused to appear triumphant. When asked whether she stood by her statement, the princess replied, "The king leads. The Prince of Wales prepares to lead. Every other role must support that truth." Her answer defended the boundary without repeating the insult. Reporters then gathered near Kensington Palace, waiting for William to choose a side. The prince released a short written statement affirming Charles's leadership, recognizing Camilla's service beside the king, and confirming the independence of his own household. He rejected the language of winners and losers. Charles ordered an end to further statements. He then invited Anne, Camilla, William, and Catherine to stand together at an upcoming remembrance service. The public had heard the sentence, analyzed the conflict, and chosen sides, but the monarchy's true answer would come without another word. At the remembrance service, there was no dramatic apology, and no attempt to pretend the confrontation had never happened. Charles arrived with Camilla beside him. William and Catherine followed in their own position. Anne stood between the generations, not as a victor, but as the person who had forced the family to recognize a truth it could no longer avoid. The monarchy had survived the conflict because, finally, every role had been named. Charles and Camilla entered first as sovereign and consort. The sovereign is the reigning monarch, while the consort is the spouse who supports that reign without inheriting the crown's authority. William and Catherine followed as the family preparing for the future, while Anne stood between the two households as the trusted figure who had forced painful clarity. The order diminished no one. It simply revealed where responsibility now rested. Anne turned towards Camilla before the service began. The two women exchanged a brief nod. There was no warmth offered for public comfort, yet the gesture confirmed that their private agreement remained intact. The Princess Royal would continue defending the boundary. The Queen would stop treating that boundary as personal rejection. Charles finally understood the cost and value of clarity. Protecting Camilla did not require granting her undefined authority over William, Catherine, or their children. By setting limits, the king preserved his marriage without sacrificing his relationship with the future sovereign. Love had not been defeated. It had been placed where it belonged. Camilla chose dignity over another battle. She accepted that supporting Charles could remain meaningful without controlling the family that would follow him. The Queen still held ceremonial standing, public responsibility, and a central place beside her husband. What she released was a form of leadership that had never formally belonged to her. William refused to turn the settlement into revenge. He offered Camilla respect, spoke without triumph, and treated the clarification as responsibility rather than victory. The prince's restraint proved the very quality Anne believed future leadership required: firmness without cruelty. Anne's statement had sounded brutal, because the family had delayed a necessary truth. She had never declared that Camilla possessed no place within the monarchy. She had declared that its future could not be governed through personal closeness to the present king. Camilla remained Charles's chosen partner, queen, and central companion. Leadership remained with the sovereign and moved towards the direct heir. Their relationships had changed permanently, but a deeper rupture had been prevented. When the family left the service together, the argument was over. Camilla stood beside the king, William carried the future, and Anne's uncompromising truth had restored the line between devotion and leadership. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.